Thank you very much. Before I start, I just want to say it's an honor to be here. The Coolidge, for those of you who have not spent a lot of time here, is really an incredible institution. I'm a longtime member, and I could not encourage you more to support it. It's really a treasure that we have it here. Also, this probably goes without saying for a talk about trauma, but there will be talk about trauma, including sexual assault and sexual abuse in this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of trauma and how we've understood it, and then talk about how that relates to Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. Humans have been describing the psychological consequences of trauma for as long as they've been telling stories. Much of the second half of the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating from around 2100 BCE, focuses on the intrusive thoughts, recurrent nightmares, and never-ending torment Gilgamesh experiences after he sets a series of events in motion that concludes with his witnessing the murder of his friend. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus returns home after 2 decades of war and exile, he's described as feeling disconnected from his past, oblivious to the potential suffering of those around him, and prone to fits of rage. Large portions of the Sanskrit epic Ramayana detail how a demon is obsessively haunted by memories of his narrowly escaping death at the hands of the story's hero. And perhaps nowhere is the emotional toll of war and violence examined more expressively than in Shakespeare's plays, from Macbeth to Othello and Richard III to Julius Caesar. Our record of understanding the effects and treating the aftershocks of trauma is much spottier. It wasn't until the 17th century when a Swiss doctor began referring to a collection of symptoms exhibited by returning soldiers, despair, insomnia, anxiety, a yearning for the past, as nostalgia, that the repercussions of trauma were first considered a medical condition. The pool of potential trauma victims was not expanded beyond male combatants until the mid-1800s, when a condition known as railway spine was coined to refer to the psychological symptoms of victims of the gruesome crashes that became common when steam engines were added to trains with rickety wooden cars riding on unreliable tracks. And it wasn't until the advent of psychoanalytic theory in the late 19th century that the idea that victims of sexual violence could experience lasting emotional damage was introduced. The codification of psychiatric symptoms in the second half of the 20th century did little to clarify the most appropriate way of defining trauma or the most effective way to treat it. Ever since the early 1950s, when the American Psychiatric Association began publishing its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM is pinballed among wildly divergent conceptions of what qualifies as trauma and the types of reactions that trauma victims might exhibit. If there's been one constant, it's that the APA's efforts to classify trauma have been undercut by the organization's lack of sophistication or interest in actually addressing the issue. In the first 2 editions of the DSM, published in 1952 and 1968, trauma-related diagnoses were only considered appropriate if the symptoms occurred for 6 months or less, the assumption being that normal individuals would recover from an event regardless of how disturbing it was in that amount of time. That notion was patently ridiculous even then. Research on the survivors of both Nazi concentration camps and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had illustrated decisively that the effects of trauma could last for years, if not decades. By the 1960s, there was also an ever-growing body of research on the effects of sexual violence on women and children. But it wasn't until the 70s, when the plight of returning Vietnam veterans began receiving widespread attention, that a more expansive conception of the effects of trauma received serious consideration. The DSM-3, published in 1980, was the first edition of the manual to allow for chronic stress-related conditions and a new diagnosis coined post-traumatic stress disorder. It would be overly simplistic to say that the psychiatric community ignored the accumulated evidence before the 1970s. Psychiatry and psychology are not monoliths, and there had been plenty of debate about the 6 months or less limit through the years. But the timing of the shift does highlight a problem that continues to plague the psychiatric community to this day. For definitions of what is normal and what is pathological to be accurate, the people setting those parameters need to either be representative of society as a whole, or have the imagination and empathy to envision what the world is like for people whose experiences differ from their own. In post-war America, discrimination against Jews and Japanese was tacitly and often explicitly accepted. The same was true of sexual violence, especially in instances in which the victims knew their perpetrators. Prior to the 1970s, marital rape was not a crime in the United States. The 1962 US Model Penal Code entry for rape begins, "Rape is defined as a male who has sexual intercourse with a female, not his wife." The implication being that a woman could not be raped by a man she was married to. It wasn't until a category of people that included large numbers of white Christians, young men returning from Vietnam, began demanding attention that the reality of the long-term consequences of trauma was validated. The addition of PTSD did not, however, signal a wholesale shift in attitudes that had long marginalized victims of trauma, and debates about the legitimacy of PTSD continue to this day. One evergreen claim is that PTSD pathologizes normal distress, which proponents of this argument maintain almost always resolves on its own. This view is personified by Paul McHugh, the former director of Johns Hopkins Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science, and the former chief psychiatrist at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. McHugh, who's described himself as someone who believes in, quote, marriage and the Marines, has complained that a faddish, quote, culture of trauma has transformed people who'd previously been honored as survivors, such as military veterans, into victims. It's unclear why one could not be both. Complaints from cultural conservatives like McHugh are the main reason that the DSM's entry on PTSD is formulated in a way that makes it unique from virtually all other diagnoses in the manual. A push from within psychiatry to apply the same standards used for physical health to mental health led to the removal from the DSM of almost all theoretical and causal explanations for diseases in favor of carefully defined descriptions. Just as a diagnosis of hypertension does not depend on why a patient's blood pressure is elevated, the thinking went, a diagnosis of clinical depression should not be reliant on the reason a person is depressed, but on the symptoms that they exhibit. But when it came to the newly created category of PTSD, it wasn't enough to simply satisfy the prescribed symptomology, which was already extremely detailed. There were also specific prescriptions for the types of distress that qualified. Trauma, according to the DSM, could only be caused by one single discrete event called a stressor that was, quote, generally outside of the range of normal human experience and would, quote, evoke significant symptoms of distress in almost everyone. The logic behind including what became known as the stressor requirement was to ensure that only catastrophic events, war, torture, rape, potentially fatal natural disasters or horrific accidents, would qualify. Regardless of how hellish the experience, anything that was due to the fickleness of human existence, a vicious divorce, losing custody of your children, the death of a relative, a life-threatening illness, losing a job or a home, could not, according to the largest psychiatric organization in the world, be traumatic. In retrospect, what is most remarkable about these requirements is the fallacies that led to them and the impossibility of implying them in any kind of uniform way. It's almost farcical for an organization whose members' purview is the diagnosis and treatment of all of the infinite varieties of mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders to argue that there is such thing as a, quote, normal human experience, or that events cannot be legitimately distressing to one person without also being distressing to almost everybody else. Stipulating certain types of reactions to traumatic events is even more peculiar. The categories of patients who were excluded from a PTSD diagnosis because they were not immediately scared or horrified included soldiers who were trained to suppress their emotions during the heat of battle, people who suffered traumatic brain injuries and lost consciousness, and victims of violent crimes whose initial reactions were rage or shame instead of terror. When the DSM-5, the most recent edition of the manual, was published in 2013, the fear, helplessness, or horror requirement was excised, but the delineation of the types of events that could be considered both outside of normal life and distressing to virtually everyone was made even more prohibitory. Now, PTSD is only a valid diagnosis for patients who have had direct exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. I tried actually putting the full requirements for PTSD on this slide and even projected on a screen this big. There's no way that you would be able to read them. Those changes are especially confounding because of the steady accumulation of evidence showing they are simultaneously redundant and detrimentally restrictive. As the field of trauma research has matured, an ever-expanding list of studies has shown that it's virtually impossible to have all of the symptoms required for a PTSD diagnosis without going through, as one recent paper by a consortium of psychiatrists from around the world put it, an event that could reasonably be described as traumatic. In other words, researchers found that when people exhibited the symptomology required for a PTSD diagnosis, the events that triggered those reactions were what you or I might label as being traumatic, even if the APA does not. That's important because it highlights the fact that the unique way that PTSD is defined in the DSM excludes people who have experienced legitimate trauma. By limiting trauma to violent acts, the DSM excludes a whole range of experiences that should, by almost any reasonable definition, qualify, including extreme emotional abuse, consistent degradation or humiliation, coerced but not physically threatened sexual activity. Just as surprising is how the clinical parameters for PTSD do not allow for variations in how individuals respond to stress. Public speaking might not be scarring for most people. It's a little Freudian slip there where I said it might be scarring for most people. My heart's beating just a little bit quickly. But for someone suffering from severe agoraphobia, being forced repeatedly to give impromptu speeches in front of large crowds could very well be traumatizing. Somehow, a clinical handbook that devotes a full 45 pages to different types of anxiety disorders does not recognize that the threshold for trauma might differ for people whose biology leaves them more reactive to the vicissitudes of life. This is important not just for semantic reasons. Beginning in the 1990s, neural imaging has consistently shown that the brain activity associated with emotion processing differs significantly in patients who've been diagnosed with PTSD, as opposed to patients with social anxiety disorders, phobias, or depression. This physiological evidence verifies what trauma specialists have been saying for years. PTSD is not just a heightened variation of the grief, agitation, or fear that people typically feel in response to difficult situations. It is a distinct condition that affects the human brain in distinct ways, and it requires distinct treatments. Today, Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me is considered by many to be a masterpiece. In 2007, The Guardian labeled it David Lynch's unsung masterwork. In 2009, the British Film Institute ranked it as the 4th best film of the 90s, and it was featured prominently on Sight and Sound's most recent poll of the greatest films of all time, ahead of Clockwork Orange, Star Wars, and Annie Hall, and tied with All About Eve, The Deer Hunter, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. This is a stark shift from how the film was greeted when it was released in 1992. 2 years after Lynch won the Palme d'Or for Wild at Heart, festival goers heaped scorn and disdain on Fire Walk with Me when it premiered at Cannes. The dominant sentiment seemed to be that it was nothing more than 2+ hours of exploitative self-indulgence. Quentin Tarantino, whose film Reservoir Dogs also screened at the festival, memorably said, "David Lynch has disappeared so far up his own ass that I have no desire to see another David Lynch movie until I hear something different." Which is especially humorous because it seems to imply that someone would just need to say, "Hey, Quentin, David Lynch is no longer up his own ass," and then he'd be totally willing to see David Lynch movies again. Critics were, if anything, even harsher. In the New York Times, Vincent Canby wrote, "It's not the worst movie ever made, it just seems to be." And here's Joel Siegel's take.
A theater or two, David Lynch really broke new ground in the episodes of the TV series. He directed using odd angles, quick cuts, flashbacks, a nonlinear script, and a driving serial music score to create a mood of building suspense you had never seen on television. In this film prequel to the series, he creates a mood you rarely see at the movies, eye-glazing boredom. I think they called the film Fire Walk with Me because after an hour of the film, you'd rather be firewalking. And at 2.5 hours, you know why Special Agent Cooper needs a good cup of joe. To stay awake. At least it's not on ABC.
Yeah, right. Hate the movie, loved the review.
Thank you.
The movie is not actually 2.5 hours. He felt compelled to exaggerate its running time by 15 minutes. Contemporary reevaluations of Fire Walk with Me have typically attributed these negative reactions to how the movie upended the expectations of viewers who'd loved Twin Peaks and mourned its premature cancellation by ABC in 1991. The TV show featured Kyle MacLachlan as FBI agent Dale Cooper, an unambiguously heroic, charismatically idiosyncratic main character. Laura Palmer, the high school student whose murder served as the show's inciting incident, was a spectral presence who could serve, at least at first, as an abstraction of female purity. Fire Walk with Me was a different beast altogether, a brutal, unrelenting examination of Laura's last days. Sheryl Lee's searing operatic performance is both painful to watch and impossible to turn away from, and her transformation from a static prom queen into a flesh and blood, drug-addicted rape and incest victim made it impossible to view the original series with quirky affection. When, towards the end of the movie, Laura tells one of her lovers, "You don't even know me, your Laura disappeared," she might as well have been talking to the audience. All of this was, undoubtedly, part of the reason Fire Walk with Me was not embraced in 1992. But upending expectations does not account for the degree of vitriol directed at Lynch. To understand that vitriol, it's helpful to look at the cultural environment into which the movie was released. The 1980s were a decade that largely treated sexual assault as a literal joke. And Splash, one running gag, has John Candy's character dropping coins so that he can look up women's skirts. And Revenge of the Nerds, the movie's heroes surreptitiously install cameras inside a sorority and go on a celebrated panty raid. And rape is featured as a prominent and humorous plot point. It was also a decade in which assault victims were often treated as a kind of perpetrator by proxy, and one in which it was not uncommon for them to act as if they welcomed the assault. In 16 Candles, the hunk presented and for decades revered as an unambiguous hero of the movie seems to feel his girlfriend's active social life makes her all but worthless. The only thing she cares about is partying, he says. I could violate her 10 different ways if I wanted to. This is during a scene in which she is unconscious. This is just a prelude to his giving permission to Anthony Michael Hall's character, billed as the geek, to assault her. She's so blitzed she wouldn't know the difference. Have fun. The next morning, when Jake's girlfriend wakes up and discovers that she spent the night with a boy she'd never met, she doesn't react with shock or outrage, but says she has a, quote, weird feeling that she enjoyed the previous night's encounter. Fire Walk with Me, in contrast, was a blunt and unequivocal examination of how patriarchal power and violence damages women. It also foregrounded the effects of violence and abuse on the victim herself. And it is this, more than anything, that people seem to abhor. Longtime BBC film critic Barry Norman described the movie as a, quote, bizarre mess of a chronicle of Laura's raunchy, randy, coke-sniffing final days. And Canby, in his New York Times review, mocked both the 24-year-old Sheryl Lee and the character she portrayed. Laura Palmer, the beautiful high school student who, as played by Sheryl Lee, looks to be approaching her mid-30s, he wrote, poor cocaine-sniffing Laura never learned how to just say no. The optimist in me wants to view the critical reevaluation of Fire Walk with Me as a sign that social beliefs about trauma and its effects on victims is changing, but I'm not sure that's true. Since the beginning of the 21st century, a small but growing group of investigators has argued that the relentless push to define trauma in a way that can be consistently applied across the entire population has led to the marginalization of huge subsets of society, including most notably people who are subjected to a never-ending drumbeat of degradation due to systemic oppression. Increasingly, there's evidence that the daily humiliations that stem from poverty, racism, sexism, and heteronormative discrimination, what one researcher refers to as the insidious trauma of socially sanctioned persecution, can cause symptoms that are identical to those associated with PTSD. A Rutgers University professor who studies stress in sexual and gender minorities has done extensive research on the effects of nonviolent prejudicial events on gays, lesbians, and bisexuals. His results, which are mirrored by research that focuses on other oppressed groups, are as striking as they are important. People who suffer from daily assaults in the form of verbal abuse, employment and housing discrimination, and social ostracization are actually more likely to exhibit the symptoms associated with PTSD than people subjected to a single threatened or actual physical assault, which would qualify, according to the APA, for PTSD. One of the reasons that trauma is so uniquely disorienting is that it scrambles the narratives people use to understand their lives. Because its logic is only understood by the perpetrators, because victims do not do anything to deserve or cause their fate, victims often unlink the event itself from its psychological aftershocks. This segregating of cause and effect that occurs creates an unconquerable challenge. Victims are desperate to protect themselves from a flood of painful emotions that has no apparent origin. Therefore, they need to prove to themselves that they can survive any possible scenario that might make them feel that way in the future. Fire Walk With Me is a tragedy without any internal logic, a chronicle of horrors that can't be justified or explained. When Laura realizes that the demonic presence that has been violating her since she was 12 years old is, in actuality, her very real father, the threads of her world seem to unravel in front of her eyes. Her murder, when it finally comes, is among the most merciless and painful acts of violence ever committed to film. For her and for the audience, it also serves as a sort of release. Finally, after more than 2 hours of brutality, we can look away. Thank you very much.